My name is Lisa Ross, though you may know me better as Paper Daisy Creations, and today I'm going to be showing you how to bind off and cast on within a row in order to create these really beautiful openings in your shawl. Now this shawl is still on the needles, it has not yet been blocked, but you'll see these little openings which are created by binding off 6 stitches on the right side row and then casting on 6 stitches on the wrong side row. And when you block this shawl, you can create nice wide openings. You can make them full circles, or you can make them just little oval slits. And when you work a bunch of these together, you can get a really beautiful wavy pattern. This stitch pattern is kind of like working lace without any of that lace work. You get these really awesome openings. It's a fun way to play with color. And there's nothing difficult about the bind off or the cast on themselves, but it is a little bit tricky how you're going to do your counting while you're doing this. So let's get started. I'm on my color 1 and I'm ready to, I've already worked my first garter stitch ridge, and when I work the wrong side of that garter stitch ridge in the color that will be used for the bind off, I counted my number of stitches to be sure that I have the correct stitch count, which will make sure that I'm successful on this next row without having to rip and reknit anything. And then there's another way we can check what's happening, just seeing how it lines up with the stitches we've already done. So as with all the rows on this, all the right side rows on this shawl, I'm going to begin with knit 1, and then I'm going to work knit front, back, front into this second stitch. Now, what I like to do is catch the yarn that's not being used since I have my main color still attached. So I'm going to go into that second stitch, but before I pick up the yarn to knit it, I'm just going to cross my unused yarn over that yarn. And then I can knit front into the back, and then again into the front of that stitch, which changes it from 1 stitch to 3 stitches. Now I'm going to be knitting 6 for this row, but be sure you follow your pattern. And now I'm ready to work bind off 6. Now, if you have finished any project in knitting, you've probably bound off stitches before, and we're going to be doing it probably the same way in which you have done this before. But the tricky thing about it is how to count, because we're going to begin by knitting these first 2 stitches before we bind one off. So I'm going to knit 1 and knit 2, and then I'm going to bind off 1. So even though I've knit 2 stitches, I've only bound off 1. Now I'm going to knit 1. Now I bind off 2, knit 1, bind off 3. And yes, I count every time I'm binding off a stitch just so I can keep track. Knit 1, bind off 4, knit 1, bind off 5, knit 1, bind off 6. And there I have my 6 stitches bound off. I find that it's trickier to count the bound off stitches by seeing, you know, this one is wrapped around here. So it's easiest for me if I just count as I'm working them. Sometimes I'll even undo those bound off stitches and just work it again to make sure that I'm counting those accurately. Now the next part of the instruction tells you to knit 4. But that's not entirely accurate because we already have one of those stitches knit. Remember how we started by knitting 2 and then we worked those bind off stitches? Well, we've already got 1 knit right here. So we're only going to knit 3 more. But when we count our stitches, we'll see that there are 4 stitches there, which is why it's written like that. And if you've ever bound off for a sleeve or in the middle of a round for a sweater, you'll know how you count these stitches. So we've bound off 6 and now we've worked our knit 4, which only involved knitting 3 more stitches. And now I'm ready to work another bind off 6. Bind off 6 begins with knitting 2 stitches. So I knit 2 stitches, and then you lift the second stitch on the needle over the first stitch. There's 1 stitch bound off. Knit 1, bind off 2, knit 1, bind off 3, knit 1, bind off 4, knit 1, bind off 5, and as I work this last stitch, I'll show you, I sort of hold my, use this finger to help hold my stitches as I'm binding off. So my second stitch is going over that first stitch, and I can kind of hold on to the first stitch as I'm pulling the other one over. So there's my bind off 6. And as a reminder, I've already worked 1 stitch, so now all I need to do is knit 3 more. So even though it says knit 4, I'll be able to count my 4 knit stitches even though I only knit 3 more. Now I've worked a few of these repeats, and before I go on to the back side, I want to show you how you can spot check your knitting. Once you've already established a set of these openings, it's really easy to line up your knitting and make sure that you're in the right spot, because what we want are for the next set of openings to alternate so that they're evenly centered above the 2 previous openings that were worked. So you can see right here, here are my 4 stitches in between, and then directly above that, you can see my 6 bound off stitches. And sometimes it helps to kind of spread it apart a little bit, but you can see, I find it easiest actually to look for the 4 stitches that are on the needle, and then going straight down from that, you can find that you've got your 6 bound off stitches right below that, that those are centered above the bound off stitches. And of course, vice versa, if you find that easier to look. You can actually take your, like a knitting needle or your fingernail and just sort of go along down here. And with these 4 stitches, they should be right in between with 1 stitch on either end of the bound off stitches because we have 4 going into 6. So that's just a little way to spot check. And I find it really important to do this a few times as you're working, especially these really long rows, because you want to be sure you're still on track and don't have to tink back too far if you get off by a stitch or 2. All right, now here I am at the very end of my row. So for this particular row, again, follow your pattern, I was supposed to bind off 6, knit 2, SSK K1. Now, just a reminder, I've already got 1 stitch on there. So while it says knit 2, I only have to knit 1 because now I have 2 knit stitches on there. I work my SSK, I knit 1, and the right side row is finished. And you can see I've got all of this looping cable right here where I have my openings. And I'm ready to work my wrong side row. So for this one, for this particular row, again, follow your pattern. I'm going to knit 4, and I come right to that large opening, and I have to cast on 6 stitches because I need to make up for all the stitches that were bound off. Now there are a lot of different ways to do it. Some will call this the backward thumb cast on or backward loop cast on. I will show you how I do it. Now this is how I'm holding my yarn, and I always hold my yarn this way. And so all I have to do is sort of turn my finger inward, and that'll give me the backward loop that I need for casting on 1 stitch. So let me show you that again. All I did was pull this finger forward, and you can see that a loop is being created. So this needle just goes into the back of that loop, and then I've got 2 stitches, 3, and you can see I just Keep that yarn the way I would normally hold it. Pull that finger forward to create a backward loop. 4 stitches, 5, and 6. Now, one important thing is to make sure that you put all 6 of those stitches on the main part of your needle. If you happen to have shorter needles and you pull them down onto the cables, you're going to make really tight loops, and that's going to be harder to deal with when you come back to them. They won't slide on and off the needles as easily. So I've got my 6 cast on stitches, and now I'm going to knit 4 because that will get me to the next opening. And now I'm going to cast on 6 stitches again. Now, when you come to the right side row, these stitches that you've just cast on are going to be a little bit tight. And they're a little bit, that row is actually my least favorite row to work. On this design, the row right after you've put on the cast on stitches. And I know I'm not to the correct point in the knit, but I'm going to show you what that looks like. I'll just rip this out. So the regularly knit stitches go no problem. But then you come to these 6 stitches, and they're all tighter than your other stockinette stitches most likely, and it might take a few tries just to get the hang of going into 1 stitch at a time. You need to be sure that you have 6 here. There was one point in this knit where I realized I actually had only cast on 4 instead of 6. So as I work that next row, I'm going to count each stitch that I go into. 1, 2, and again I use my other finger to hold those stitches on there, the ones that are not being knit, just so they don't slide off. You really don't want to lose any stitches here because it's important for your stitch count and for the design. So I've knit my 6 stitches, and those are the harder stitches to work. And I'm going to show you what happens if you lose a stitch. So if I am knitting a stitch here and I pull and one comes off, and now I only have 4 stitches and I need 5 more because I've already knit 1. It's actually not that hard to turn your knit to the wrong side and just create that backward loop again. And so what I'm going to do is, just as if it was over my finger, I'm even going to show you by putting my finger in there and turning my finger, I can just scoop that yarn back on. And so even if you lose a stitch, it's not a big deal. Just flip it to the wrong side and cast it on just the same way you cast it on to begin with. Thank you so much for joining me, and I wish you all very happy knitting.